Hi folks, here with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about this constant assertion that's pushed by the activist, globalist-funded propaganda machine that white society and white wealth and white riches of Western white society, it has no legitimacy, zero legitimacy. Why? Because the reason white people are richer than all the other groups around the world is because they stole it from everybody. That's why they're white people are richer. It was all stolen, and therefore it's not legitimate. And white people have to really give back everything they stole, or at the very, very least, share it out equally in terms of equity, equal outcomes, with all the black and brown people of the world. And then and only then will the evil, wicked, Nazi, fascist souls of the white people go through some sort of process of salvation. So that's the claim. Now, if you look at really any of these talk panels around the world, particularly where the globalist machine or the United Nations or European Union or any of those are involved, you'll see that same thing. The speakers, nearly all sort of low IQ people, but they all come really from that same position, that the only reason white people are rich is because they either stole from the brown and black people, or they somehow held them back so they couldn't develop into a first world technology. Now, these are just asserted. No evidence is given. It's just an assertion, and they're usually sort of backed up with sort of emotional claims. There'll be always a reference to Nazis in 1930s Germany and these sorts of things, and but there's no attempt to prove their case. And then other people that other speakers who may be taking a different point of view are simply denounced as Nazis or fascists or white supremacists and so on. And this is quite an effective device for silencing a lot of people, or even the serious speakers and serious experts that may in other circumstances happily debate this and debunk it in seconds flat. They just don't want to come onto the stage to be jeered and howled at by an audience of university sociology kids or by other activists in this area, and also be denounced as Nazis or fascists or something, simply because they can prove with facts the nonsense of these assertions. And I've looked at some brave folks that are prepared to get up and say and factually argue, look, this is nonsense. The idea that white people are wealthy or rich because they stole everything is complete and utter nonsense, and prove it with some good, reliable, unimpeachable facts. But they still get howled down and screamed at and jeered at and so on. And then there's the absolute fury of social media attacks and so on. Now, if white people were to attack brown people in the same way in social media, they'd be cancelled. They'd probably have the police knocking on their door. But because one side is allowed to permitted, even encouraged, and financially rewarded for attacking white people, then that goes on. And effectively every Western government is now globalist controlled, and their job is to ensure the eradication of their own white Western culture, and so the machine to do that is, of course, one of accusation, humiliation, demoralization, and to say, well, no, they can call you a Nazi, but you can't call them a Nazi, and that type of thing. So, and that's very much the police are now an enforcement arm of the globalists. The globalist policy. Anyway, I just wanted to look at these. Why did the white West become rich on a relative basis, at least, and maintain that position for really, still even to the present day. So the white West, say from the mid 1500s, whether you look at sort of the original Spanish Empire, that sort of thing, but from the mid 1500s up until the present day. So that's a long stretch. We're pushing 500 years or so on that. That the West came to dominate. White people came to dominate the the mercantile age, international trade, and then of course the industrial age. Now, like anybody, if somebody works at the same job for 5 days a week and someone else works at the same job for 1 day a week, the person that works 5 days a week will be richer than the person that works 1 day on a relative basis. So this is just basic. No one needs to explain that. Someone who works 5 days, someone who works 1 day. Now, by the same token, if somebody is say they're I don't know, working as a landscape gardener or lawn mower, or I'm taking a sort of simple thing here. If somebody mows 10 lawns a day and the other person mows 1 lawn a day, then the person who does 10 lawns a day, who would be working much harder, will make more money. So whether you look at it in terms of the amount of hours worked or you look at the amount of work done, there's a clear difference between someone who does more work or works more hours and someone who does less work or works less hours. And really, that's more or less the situation between the West and the rest of the world. That's why the West became rich. Now, if you put that to any activist, any woke social justice type activist, and said someone who mows 10 lawns a day will make more money than someone who makes 2, they won't dispute that one will make more money. They may come in and say, well, the reason the person that does 10 lawns a day is because they're fitter and more capable, and therefore they will make more money, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't share what they have with the person who did 2 lawns a day. This is where the Marxist angle comes in. So the Marxist, each according to his needs, each according to his capacity. So the Marxist argument is that if that you see in the communist societies, is that if someone's capable of mowing 10 lawns a day, and someone else mows 1 lawn a day, regardless of whether they're just lazy or incapable or they don't want to, can't be bothered, or their their lawnmower keeps breaking down. So that doesn't matter. Those things are all irrelevant. The fact that person A did 10 lawns and person B did 1 lawn, that's the only material issue, because we have to equalise outcomes. Inputs, causation, irrelevant. Or they'll argue it's racism or something like that. But they say, well, you have to put the money you make from mowing 10 lawns into the pot with the person that mowed 1 lawn in the day, and then you split it up equally, and then that's the equity. So these sort of attitudes also permeate the thinking and become very much the way, the prism through which things are looked at. And it's very much a one-way telescope here. So why shouldn't the person that busts their ass mowing 10 lawns a day, running from lawn to lawn and working from the minute the sun comes up until the second before the sun goes down, why shouldn't they make more money? They're working much harder. But the argument that the activists do is, well, that person has a greater capacity for work, but that doesn't mean that their outcomes in life should be any different than the person who has much lesser capacity or much less inclination to work. They still should throw the money in the pot and then share it out equally. So when you have these sort of attitudes to social communal type behaviour, then any difference in outcomes must be due to some sort of form of evil, and that's really where they come from. So now, if we come back to the early days of the white, the white sort of ascendancy, now you can point to situations of exploitation of brown people and black people and so on. There's no question of that. But that's not in any way decisive in anything. That's not the deciding factor by any stretch, and never was. And only activists who see things through that one-way telescope could come at that. But again, they're encouraged by the globalists for the sole and very cynical purpose of undermining and demoralising Western civilization today, which makes it much easier for the globalists to take over. Now, the reason the West became rich in comparison, it's all relative, comparison to other parts of the globe, It comes down to a few sort of basic things, and they're all really technological and organisational. So the West was the first to develop long ocean-going vessels. Now, within this, there was some the capacity to navigate across oceans and things like that. That was pretty much a Western invention. I mean, you can do the stars and navigate by the stars, but that's real hit and miss. So the long ocean-going vessels, and there was various design sort of things in that. Just wasn't one design. Design of the ships, the hulls, the keels, the sails, the rigging, the pulleys. There was a whole lot of sort of micro type innovations and inventions that went into a total technology story to go on these long ocean-going vessels. Now, it's no point having a long ocean-going vessel if you're going to pick up spices or some tradable commodities or goods. If you can only fit a few little pieces in your ship, you've got to have a carrying capacity in the ship, and so the designs in that sort of sense were also not that other places didn't have, other parts of the world didn't have vessels that were technologically similar in some ways, but they were only vessels that could navigate rivers or stay close to shore. You look at really any of the other players in the game, they were very reluctant to leave a situation where they couldn't see the shoreline from where they were. They were inshore type vessels. Now, sometimes they would go across inland seas, but that would be all, and they would only do it at certain times of year and so on. So there was only the Europeans had that long ocean-going technology, and that was decisive in giving the mercantile age to the Europeans. Any race or group of people from anywhere could have, the Indonesians or the Indians could have had developed long ocean-going vessels and sailed across to Europe and said, "Hey guys, we got all these spices here, pepper and cinnamon and whatever else, so do you want to buy this stuff?" And they'd have had ready and eager customers in the West, so that they could have done that, but they didn't. It was the West that developed that technology and put it to use, in this case commercially, of course, during the mercantile age. Now, another thing that was, again, a small issue, but it's kind of decisive, the use of cannons. Now gunpowder, saltpeter and that sort of stuff was widely available on the surface of the land in China. There was a couple of places in Africa and that place in China. They were the only places in the world where as I understand it, that saltpeter, this is a key component of gunpowder, saltpeter was on the surface. So if you set up a little campfire as you were traveling across that part of China, you would have found that the dirt, that the ground that the fire was put on would start to explode. And you go, "Oh, what's that?" And the idea that Chinese invented gunpowder is bullshit. It was on the ground, one of the very few places in the world where that appears. There was again another place in Africa, but the Europeans moved forward in big strides in metallurgy. So even though other places had cannons, the Ottoman Empire, this sort of thing, the Europeans started to develop cannons that were single cast and were made of cast iron, so they could shoot heavier objects further, like cannonballs. They could shoot them further with greater accuracy, and that because it was cast as a single unit, it was able to be, it was more serviceable. It would last longer, could be maintained more easily than the brass type cannons that existed previously, or where the casting put two or more pieces together. You'd shoot a cannonball and all the bits would come apart, and so this made actually a substantial difference in the firepower the Europeans could bring to bear if there was a conflict or a battle, or if local potentates around the the East in particular, where the spice was sought, it would renege on deals, or would say, well, I know I agreed to, $50 a ton, but I've now decided it's 100. Got a problem with that, buddy. And then the European guys, yeah, actually I do see those cannons there, those sorts of things. So that technology, that metallurgy in this case was also, I think, decisive. When I say decisive, I mean if you got a bunch of cannons on a ship, for example, and you can only really get off a few shots before your cannon is useless, you'd be very, very reluctant to risk it in certain situations. But if you had a cannon that could easily, because it was that serviceable and that robust, it could get off 100 shots, then you would say you would be more inclined to use that if you thought it was necessary. So that metallurgy. Now the other thing was organisational. The Europeans were just better organised, and also I'd say more cohesive. Not that there weren't religious strife, there was. The Martin Luther and the Protestants and all that sort of stuff. There clearly was religious strife, and some of it convulsed whole areas of mainland Europe. But and also other sort of associated strife, like the Inquisition and things like that. But so those problems were there, but they weren't to the same extent as they were elsewhere. For example, religious strife in India and petty fiefdom type strife and all that sort of stuff. That was rampant in India. And even Alexander the Great commented on how fractured the North Indian society was, how all these petty little fiefdoms all seemed to spend more time fighting each other than anything else, and also being very disruptive to each other's commercial activities and this sort of thing. And that was 320 BC. So the situation that the Europeans uncovered, the Portuguese and the French, the British, and so the India of the 1500s, 1600s, and so on was no different from the India that Alexander the Great had encountered 1800, nearly 2000 years prior. So it goes to show you that Indian society had really not developed a lick since the days of Alexander the Great, whereas Western society, by comparison, had come quite a long way. So there was a much more cohesion, much more unity amongst the Europeans compared to the Indians, the Indonesians, or elsewhere. So the differences were huge. The Europeans were the only ones that could get over there with their ships and conduct trade in a volume, as in ships could carry a lot of stuff, could do it in a volume that made it economical and in some cases very profitable. Now, the other thing that the Europeans were a little bit different in, and this is a very important point, is that the concept of trade and the profit motive, the Europeans had acquired a profit motive view to things where they'd be prepared to negotiate a situation where there could be, wins all round, win-win as they call it today. Now that didn't mean it wasn't, loaded in favour of the Europeans, but this idea of relative risk, reward for that risk, those sorts of things, and the idea, look, I want to do business with this guy again next year, on the next voyage. So there's no point in me screwing him to the extent that he won't want to do business with me, or he'll avoid it, or he'll try and get back at me in some other way. It's better that given all the options, it's better that I don't screw the guy. Now, this is something that came from I wouldn't say uniquely Western Europe, but certainly very much a part of Western Europe and very much part of the British ruling class. Not that workers didn't get screwed, they did, but the idea was that if we screw them too hard, they'll turn into a mob and they'll start causing us all sorts of problems. So there's no point in us really doing that. We may as well try and convince them to come with us. And again, this is part of the roots of democracy and voting and so on. We might as well cut a deal with them and not have to worry about them giving us trouble, rather than screw them or cheat them or fuck them over and then find that they're going to be filled with sullen resentment for years to come. So this was very much a European thing. Now, this was not something that was practiced. Other cultures, particularly India, they had the caste system where it was the universally ordained position of the people at the bottom to be exploited. That was their role, to be exploited. So there was none of this thought of, well, let's not exploit them. Oh, gee, we shouldn't do that. Let's try and, get them to be happy. So, no, their role is to be exploited. Their role is to be exploited and die, and that we walk over their dead bodies without even noticing these sorts of things. That's not something that was prevalent in the West. So the idea of sort of cutting and negotiating the deal that would sort of work all around, that was something that was uniquely Western, and I don't think other cultures, could have successfully done that in the same way, with that profit motive concept. Now, it was very expensive to get a ship from say Europe to India or somewhere like that. It was took a lot of money. You had to have a number of ships to make it worthwhile, and so each of those ships had to be crewed. You got to have food and everything on board for the crew, and you've got to run the risk of storms and all sorts of things. So you need good quality officers and navigators. You can't scrimp on that. You can't have navigators that don't know where they're going or are going to lead you into into some sort of dangerous reef, and you lose all your ships. So you've got to put the money on the table to get that fleet of merchant ships over there. You need a certain amount of weaponry and cannons and so on in case pirates come and try and steal your stuff. So it was a very expensive, high risk venture. So that when the cargo ships, the merchant ships arrived in India, they needed to know in advance that they had a deal. They would make the deal for, in 12 months' time, we'll come back and we'll buy that whole lot of spices over there. Now, the Indians, and the Indians are the same today, by the way, they haven't changed. And the commentary from all the Europeans, and indeed from even earlier travellers, with how the Indians did business, they still do it that way now. So it invariably came to conflict. The Indian merchant would invariably renege on the deal, thinking that maybe he'll run a chance to try and screw the Europeans for a few more bucks. And I mean, if it was probably $1 or $2, they wouldn't really care. But these weren't just 1% screwing. This was like, I want double from what I agreed to. But you've signed a contract here. It says $100 for that ton of spices. Well, I want 200 now. You've got a problem with that, and so that would often lead to conflict. Also, because the situation in India was so fractious with religious groups and petty little fiefdoms and succession issues and so on. The area was constantly in some state of either warfare or simmering tension with armed bands running around. So given the investment and the risks to the investment and this profit motive thing, the Europeans and the British were probably the biggest exponents of this. If we're going to guarantee our supply and guarantee that the contracts get honoured, we're going to have to take over, this section between the spice fields and the ports. And we need to have a reliable port, so we're going to have to take over this port, and so on. Now, you may look at that years later and say, well, that's it. The fascist Nazis exploiting. No, it wasn't anything to do with that. That's quite ridiculous. So the reasons for the Europeans becoming rich, preparedness to take risk, and there's a whole range of things. Long ocean going technology, this sort of thing, that made it a uniquely European exercise. And of course, with that massive trading network that they already had in the mercantile age, again, the British in particular, when the Industrial Revolution came along, the British already had this massive trading infrastructure in place. So it plugged beautifully into their production of manufactured goods. So that's why Britain and the West became wealthy, those technological reasons. Now, Spain, there's a comment about Spain and Portugal that were very rich at one point. The Portuguese were so rich that they used to come to England in the 1600s, and they would see how dirty and uncouth and so on, thinking that Britain would never amount to, England would never amount to anything because they were such a backward, vulgar, unclean people. Yes. That's Portugal, for goodness sake. Portugal's now, of course, a basket case. But Portugal and Spain became rich by getting the South American gold and silver. Now, gold and silver had no value or worth in South America, or not in the financial sense that it did in Europe. Whereas, getting that sort of gold for the Europeans, that could pay for wars and all sorts of things. Now, the Spanish frittered nearly all that wealth away in wars. Hardly any of it went into, say, modernization. So the Spanish Empire became used to all this gold coming in, and in every conceivable way fell behind the other European powers such as France and Britain. So they we got to the point where Spain was one of the basket cases of Europe because they relied so heavily on this easy money rather than efficiency and effectiveness. I guess the other thing was the Europeans were, and again the British probably the better exponents of this, were prepared to rely on efficiency to achieve profits rather than screwing over the other party in the deal. And this was something that also separated, because once you go down the path of efficiency, whether it's production, whether it's in organisation, or it's in finance, double column accounting, and all that sort of, once you go down that path, you see other opportunities for profitability that do not involve taking something from someone else. Now, the Indian view of profit and the Chinese view, in fact, most of these places, was that they didn't see things through efficiency and technological advances. They just saw things the only way I can get rich is to take from what you have. And so this attitude played into the completely different overall attitudes of how money was made, and again, why Europeans went ahead technologically. I'll just add one sort of comment. You see this, and I've mentioned this before, where I've seen there's a I think I've mentioned previously, we live right on the edge of a forest, so we see a lot of wildlife, marsupials, all sorts of different things here, and there's a certain local breed of parrot, and it has a very specialized beak. There's only certain seeds and things like that you can eat. It's actually got a very narrow range of foods it can eat, which are all local to this area. Now, because there's been a change in the vegetation, mainly humans, adding colourful tropical type trees all along the east coast of the central east coast of Australia, there's a breed of parrot that is more tropical, and there was a band of I don't know, there's an area, a corridor of land that was maybe 200 plus miles, 300 kilometres or so, where the tropical vegetation didn't exist. So those tropical parrots didn't come down south. But since the vegetation was changed, they have. And now they're competing with these local parrots, and the local parrots aren't holding up too well. The reason for this is that the parrots from the tropical area, their beaks can eat a much wider range of seeds. So they've got and you can say equate the beak to technology. They've just got a more advanced technology, so they can eat a much wider range of food. But they also eat the same foods as this local parrot does. So this local parrot's kind of getting squeezed out of the game, and their numbers have dropped quite considerably over the last 10 years or so. And you can I can see it here in like the backyard. They just can't compete with these other parrots. So they're just nowhere near it. So the other parrots have a much wider range of food they can eat, so more advanced technology, but they're also much better organisationally. that the local parrot tends to live a fairly solitary existence, so that when they come to eat some seeds, the other parrot from the north, from the tropical end, they move around in mobs, usually, at least 3, if not 5 or 6 or more. So they come in and they mob the local parrot and push it and peck at it. So the local parrot sort of just goes. It just can't handle it being mobbed. Nor is it used to it. It's never evolved in that sort of environment. So you could see the parrot just doesn't know what to do, and it flies off and leaves the food to these blow-ins. Now, on top of that, the other parrots are organisationally much better. The tropical parrots are just organisationally much better. So if there's a pile of seeds, they'll come in. They may squabble for a moment or two, but they'll quickly divide up. It's almost like they look at what seeds are there, go, okay, we can have 10 seeds each, and then they just get on with it, and they eat the seeds. They divide it up. The squabbling stops, and they get on. They consume all the seeds as quickly as they can. Then they fly off and they're gone. So they're organisationally, they're much better. Now the local parrot, if other parrots do turn up, if there's a pile of seeds there, instead of getting on and eating them or dividing it up, they squabble. They will just squabble the whole time, wings flapping, and they'll land in the middle of the seeds, kick them out in all directions. So in the end, no one gets anything. So in their cognizance, preventing the other parrot from getting any, the same breed, preventing the other parrot from getting food is their primary objective. Getting something to eat themselves, irrelevant. So organisationally, they're very self-destructive in the way they go about things. Now, whereas they'll without even a second's thought, they'll seed that they'll give up the seeds to these other parrots. When it comes to parrots of their own breed, they'll fight to the death, for goodness sake, feathers flying and all that sort of thing. So you can see they've evolved in a certain way to deal with certain conditions, but they just don't know what to do. They can't compete with these new parrots that are organisationally and technically more advanced, and you can see the success of the other parrots in how they go about. And this is just a metaphor, really for what happened with the white people in the West. The white people just had better technology. They were better organized. That's all it was. Now, you can say things like they were more industrious or had better systems and procedures. You can go down that path, and that's true, by the way. But the idea that the white people stole the wealth from these other cultures and places is ridiculous. I'll mention a final point here where there's the argument of that the Europeans took like things like iron ore or whatever from Africa, or where they took absolute virgin lands and turned them into super productive farms, this sort of thing. That's treated as theft. So, well, you stole the land from those people and made profit out of it. That means you stole everything that was ever produced. Now that completely ignores the value add idea. The black people in Africa could have themselves built farms, productive farms, if they'd wanted. They didn't. Also, because most of them were hunter-gatherer groups, they weren't using the land for anything. They would maybe walk across it to get from A to B or something like that, but they weren't using the land. The other thing is any precious metals or any metals of any sort, anything that was extracted from the ground that the Europeans took had no value to the locals. The local Africans had no metallurgy industry. They didn't know what it was. So the idea that the Europeans should have paid to the Africans a full commercial price that you would pay if you went to a first world country, again, is ridiculous and quite absurd. So in summary, that when you hear this argument that the difference in wealth between white countries and black countries or brown countries is only because of the white people stole it is absolute nonsense. Can you find instances where there were one-sided trading deals, that were exploited? For example, the Portuguese getting pearls from the around Goa and all that from the local pearl fishermen and that sort of thing. But even that, the value that the pearls were in the local Indian situation were vastly different from the value they had in the European market. So were the Europeans who'd paid for all the ships and all the transport and all their infrastructure, should they have paid a first world price to those people? or should they have paid the local price of the local value to the people? It's equivalent. You know, I did a lot of traveling on business, and if I went to shops for Westerners, you know, I could buy items that were in, you know, I could buy them in Sydney or any Western country, and they wanted the same price for them in these third world countries. So if it was like, you know, I don't know, 100, for example, $100 for a pair of jeans in Sydney, they wanted $100 in this. But if I went to the local shop where the locals would buy stuff, then those same jeans were $20. So was it incumbent on me to pay the local price that everyone else was paying there, or should I pay an international price, which was $100 for the pair of jeans? And it's that same sort of thing here that they're using. The Indians, you know, are shockers for using this sort of mathematics, saying, well, everything the Western people got from India should all have been at a first world premium price, and the difference between what the Europeans did pay and the international premium price, that's the extent of the exploitation. That is bullshit, absolute bullshit. Wherever you hear nonsense like that, push back against it. You've been with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.